Here we go. All righty then, we're live. Hello and welcome to The Way It Should Be. This is going to be a series of chats that we use as the basis of hopefully a production.
The way it should be.
The way it should be, yeah. So I'm going to basically be doing a book in an entire series called The Way, and it's going to be the way. We'll talk about the way, like the. Not going to be the Wu way.
The way it should be.
I mean, the Wu way is a very famous way.
You're writing a Bible. You should go the Bible. Barlow's Bible.
I mean, the Bible literally just means the book, doesn't it? So, like, I mean, I'm going that level of simplicity.
Yeah. You never set the bar too low, Barlow.
Yeah. Fucking hell, man. Is this the level of wordplay we're working with? This is going to be.
You can have that. As long as you give me all like the £1 that you're going to make for the book. I want
Jesus fucking Christ. Right, well, let me try and explain that to the audience again. This is the way it should be. So we're going to do a book and a series of essays and maybe short films that explain or talk about the way it is, the way it should be, and the way we change things. And that's what we're looking at doing. But you and what I wanted to talk about with Tommy is the way it should be. So each episode, we're going to talk about a proposition that I have that I think in an ideal, not an ideal world, but a better world, we would do this thing or we wouldn't do this thing. And so this episode, we're talking about legalizing drugs. That's like, and I'm talking about legalizing all drugs. That's all of them. Let's not just fanny around at the edges and talk about legalizing weed. We're talking about all drugs here. So, yeah.
When was that? Was that the front page of The Independent?
Yes, it was the front page of The Independent, and I don't know when it was. It was quite a while back, but.
Well, this is quite old hat, this argument, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
As long as drugs have been available.
Yeah, and to be honest, though, there was an uptick in it. I found a load of videos that did big debates versus debates, the Intelligence Squared debates in 2013, 2014. And, Russell Brand was doing a lot of pushing for it at the time. And there was like a lot of other things, there was other people talking about it. And it was becoming a high profile thing sort of towards the end of the Obama presidency and during Cameron's era when things had settled down a bit. And then it pops its head up at now and again. But what there isn't is any like really strong, well-organized single issue campaign group that really is pushing this through in the United Kingdom or globally, really. Though the cannabis legalization groups have been very well organized in the US and one thing state by state.
States in the US. And why did that even happen? Because that seemed to come out of the blue.
Well, lots of people worked on it for a long time. Do you know Hunter S. Thompson? Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, so the kind of gonzo journalist who took a lot of acid. Well, he settled out in Colorado, and Colorado was the first state to legalize weed. And he said there was a lot of hippies and beatniks and sort of unusual people who went and settled out in Colorado during the 60s, 70s. And I can't help but think, because he almost won a local election there to be sheriff of all things, that Colorado has quite a unique mix of people. And I think, the second state was California. So I think, or maybe it was Washington state, but, states with like high proportions of sort of quite liberal minded exploratory weed smokers, but who got bit by bit organized. And the thing about the US that we forget is that it's a effing continent, it's so fucking huge. Each one of these places is a country, 5, 10, 50 million people, like a small, like Belgium or Holland or something like that. And things can be going on there that we've not even heard about, but people could have been working away at it in the background for like 2 decades. So.
And states also have quite a lot of independence to make legislation.
What was that? Sorry. The states can independently make legislation.
Law, yeah. A lot more freedom.
Yeah, they Yeah, they do. And, actually, you start looking at it and you think, well, the United Kingdom could do with being more federal, because I think it's not just Scotland and Wales, but the north of England, I think clearly needs to start having a lot more control over its own affairs. I think honestly, if you gave us the option, the ability to legalise cannabis, for instance, in Manchester or Greater Manchester, we would do it. Actually, I've got a thing here, Town Hall Boss in Cannabis Call. Richard Leese has been kind of who's the council leader of Manchester, has always been sort of pro legalization, and even now kind of directs the police to not bother arresting people around cannabis use and stuff like that, because it's just a waste of police resources. So, you can see there'd be an appetite for it at sort of, a local level. Certainly, Greater Manchester Police. Again, they say we'll enforce the law, but the rumblings are that they don't even want to enforce it. It's just a waste of their time,
Mm-hmm.
And policemen love arresting people. So,
it does seem like they could probably spend their time fighting different crimes that are more harmful in general to society.
Yeah.
Police,
well,
yeah. Police are very restricted, aren't they? And they're always getting budget cuts, and they're always saying that it's difficult for them to keep on track of the work that they have to do. So increasing that workload by by arresting people who are smoking cannabis seems to be, something that I can understand why they would be less inclined to want to do it.
Yeah, it's a waste of their time, and their thin resources. Like I say, they love banging people up, they love hitting their targets, and that kind of stuff does help them do it, which is, on the one hand, why they often stringently enforce it. But on the other hand, you hear, mumblings from certain high figures. There's been ex-top police officers, like chief commissioners and stuff like that, who once they're out of the job say, yeah, 100% legalize it, and come out and done speaking tours on it, and they say that they know people in the force want it legalized because it's, they just don't see any point in criminalizing users. So this brings me to let me introduce the case for legalization. And like I say, this one, out of all the ones that we do, should be the one that we have the least argument and discussion on. It's a way of easing into these debates and discussions, because I know we'll have some tiffs on the other one. But the case to legalize all drugs is kind of a no-brainer, really, unless there's particular things that you want to achieve, which we'll talk about in a bit. But there's a three-pronged argument: moral, logical, and empirical. And that's really is this a good thing? Does it make sense? And what are the facts, basically? So morally speaking, is it a good idea to criminalize drugs? Or is it a good idea to legalize them? And the libertarian argument, the sort of freedom, I am a human being who has control over my own life, basically says, morally speaking, as long as I'm not harming anyone else, I can do what I like with my body. It's not for other people to judge what is and isn't harmful. It's for me. Now that runs into some problems when you think about you can do your community harm by developing addiction that makes you make poor judgments that sort of negatively affect the rest of the community. Nonetheless, if you take those other actions, let's say you're stealing to feed your habit, for instance, well, that is criminalized. So you don't need to criminalize the drug use, and there's many reasons that people steal. Other addictions like alcohol and gambling, but also poor personal choices, impulse, poverty is a key one, and probably the main driver of theft. So ultimately, having unsafe, expensive, illegal drugs, is actually probably a bad thing, and that's more in the factual area. But morally speaking, I believe people should have their own choice. So what do you think about the moral case? Because that's my moral case. It's quite a simple one. If you're not harming anyone else, you should be allowed to do it. There really shouldn't need to be any other evidence around whether it's a good or a bad thing. We should be free people to do what we choose to do.
Well, it's an interesting case, isn't it? Because what you're saying is that how influential should government, in particular law, be in prohibiting and restricting people's personal freedom? So essentially, what drug law is saying is that drugs are dangerous, at least on face value. Drug law is predicting a harm, but the harm is towards yourself. It is really a crime against yourself. If you're taking drugs, and as I said, you do have extra societal crimes that you mentioned or harms that you mentioned, but really, if you're not like abusing drugs in such a way, if you're a recreational user and you're just taking drugs because you enjoy to, then that harm is directed solely at you. And it's about what kind of level of government intervention do we need to stop someone harming themselves? It's quite an interesting question, really, because most legislation is directed very specifically at harm against others. If you think of most criminal legislation, so the Homicide Act, or for example, Offence Against a Persons Act, all these things, Female Genital Mutilation Act, and they're very specifically trying to protect people, and they restrict people's freedom to murder someone else, for example. But the societal harm is seen as it's more important to restrict that freedom to protect the person, the victim. But the victim in drug law is essentially yourself.
Yeah. And, also, who's to judge that it's a harm? Now, again, you can come up with some factual points about this. Like, they've shown that the use of ketamine is a fantastic antidepressant, that they've got pensioners or people who with terminal illnesses to use acid, and it significantly increased their mental health and made them welcome their impending death, right? Like, the understanding God through taking DMT might actually be, a societal positive. A lot of people arguing for cannabis use, saying like, it makes you pretty relaxed. So, what's the harm in it? Now, again, we can get into a factual case here, but like, and that's sort of for later on down the line. But in terms of just morally speaking, again, this is why we believe in freedom to allow you to do the things that you want to do. Because you're probably, not always, but in most cases, you should be the judge of what is or isn't harmful for yourself.
Well, I mean, with some caveats. I mean, sometimes people don't do that. If you talk about someone who is deep within an addiction, often they don't really understand or appreciate the harm that it's doing to them, and they do need a sort of intervention.
Yes, but do they need a criminal intervention? Like, morally, you don't ban someone from doing something that's harmful to themselves either. Like, you don't arrest people for trying to commit suicide or for self-harm.
And that's a good parallel, actually, because the more research that's been done on addictive behavior, the more sort of clear and apparent it's becoming that it's actually a mental health illness. And what essentially you're doing is, in the case of addicts, not every drug user is going to be an addict, but in the particular case of addictive drug use, you're criminalizing a mental health disorder.
Yeah, and I think, that's it. And again, that's I think that's why you say to people, you're free to do what you want. And at that point that it's causing harm to yourself, well, then we step in, but we don't. But it doesn't, and I think, I'm a communitarian as well as a libertarian. I believe in community and personal freedom. I believe you mesh the two together. What I don't believe is that you criminalize people for hurting themselves or for doing things that damage themselves. First off, it doesn't work, stopping them. But more importantly, that's not how we treat, like, morally, there is no good case to criminalize someone, to punish someone for inflicting damage upon themselves. There's no good case for that. There's no moral case for that.
You could take it. So, well, just say you've got the example of somebody who's a heroin addict, and it's very we know that it's harmful to be a heroin addict. There's risk of overdose, there's risk of impurity in the drug itself, all these social harms. But if you look at it from a purely harm perspective, sanctioning someone using imprisonment might actually increase those harms, because you're surrounded by other criminals. You may increase your drug use in jail, or alter your drug use. What was that?
That's just a little image. Sorry, it's just underlining your point. Sorry, continue.
Well, it's just basically saying that if you look at harms, yes, being a heroin addict is harmful, but going to jail is extremely harmful as well.
Yeah.
It ruins your job prospects. If you've got any kind of stability in your life at all, so maybe a girlfriend or a house, that's gone as soon as you've got a custodial sentence. Essentially, a landlord's not going to keep you on. You're not going to be able to afford your rent. You need to have a very committed, patient partner if she's going to stay with you while you're in a custodial sentence.
Yeah.
The harm related. So someone's already harming themselves through addictive behavior. Is it then compounding that harm by sending them to jail? I think there's a good case to say that.
Yeah, it seems pretty reasonably obvious that it is. So yeah, that's the kind of like moral and personal case. And like I say, there's sort of like, does it make sense on a logical, rational kind of thing? The empirical case is the factual case is pretty strong to show that, like, criminalizing drugs doesn't work as well. And we'll come round to that. It just doesn't work on any level. It doesn't stop the flow of drugs. It doesn't stop people getting them. And of course, creates a whole bunch of other negative side effects. Whereas if you, like, for instance, decriminalize drugs, in Portugal, where they decriminalized heroin usage, it dropped by 50%. The usage.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point as well, because I was just thinking, it popped into my head, that being gay used to be an offense. So what used to be called buggery, basically just homosexual relations between men. And then later in the Offences Against the Person Act, it was a defined crime. Buggery was a defined crime. And it was a very significant penal penalties were attached to it. So Oscar Wilde was committed to 2 years solitary confinement for having sex with Alfred Douglas.
Yeah.
Which is so minor in today's kind of like mores that we find that so kind of crazy. But at the time, it was a very serious crime, but it didn't stop people from being gay. People are gay anyway. It's penalizing something that isn't really a crime.
Yeah. And I think, well, look, when you talk about homosexuality and other crimes, things that were deemed immoral and were criminalized as such, which which are just inherent human features, like, being gay is an inherent human feature, right? Like, if you are gay. Though there's some research that says some of it's slightly due to upbringing and things like that, but or some instances, maybe people feel more comfortable to explore sexuality due to upbringing or something. But it's, as far as we can tell, it's like, it's who you are. Regardless, it's not an immoral act.
Yeah.
But those criminalization, like that criminalization, stands alone to, like, using substances, and of course what we're talking about here, we're talking about the prohibition of certain substances, not other substances. So actually, I'm going to bring up an image here, and I'm going to show you. It's Professor Nutt's graph of harms that are created by different drug use. Now, the one there that creates by far the most harms to society in costs to society, deaths related to it directly through addiction, and deaths related to it through, like driving and so forth like that, is alcohol by like a long distance. Heroin and crack cocaine up there, they're quite high. And then you see the rest, it all just bottoms off to comparatively insignificant amount. And there's different ways of illustrating this. So if you're watching the video, then that's what we're showing you here, these different illustrations of this. But this curve is it shows that, like, empirically speaking, factually speaking, there is, alcohol is considered is an unprohibited substance, but it is extremely socially damaging in every way. Health wise, it's more damaging to the body. Alcohol's more damaging to your own body than heroin is, for instance, and stuff like that. Like,
how were they able to quantify this?
Well, you'll have to go into Professor Nutt's studies. These are like huge, like multivariable studies. But like, so I put up the thing, but we'll put some links in the description and I'll send it to you. And what essentially he did was he looked at social harms, like I say, you know, accidents caused by this, criminality that's caused by addiction, the levels of addiction. He also looked at health harms, right? Like, so for instance, alcohol-related psoriasis is very prevalent, you know, liver disease, liver cancers caused by alcohol usage, far higher than like crack cocaine and heroin. You could use them, you know, and these are the most damaging. You could still use them all of your life and suffer far lower health consequences to your person in most cases than you're going to with alcohol. Alcohol is going to destroy your body, like it's going to absolutely rip it to shreds. And of course, they haven't included in the study sugar, you know, which is
just on that point. So alcohol, it used to be said that you could drink a glass of wine and be good for you, but now the WHO has said that there's no beneficial dose of alcohol.
Right. Yeah, and the WHO usually sit on the fence for as long as possible. So I guess, yeah,
it's been linked to cancer, all sorts of different cancers. So not liver cirrhosis, cardiovascular problems. It's really harmful. Alcohol is a very harmful drug.
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily devastating drug. And as I say, sugar's not on there, nicotine's not on there, caffeine's not on there, and caffeine has like actually quite a lot of negative effects. They say the high rate of stomach problems are actually related to caffeine ingestion. It's why omeprazole is the most used drug in the Western world.
I take it.
Yeah, and I do too.
But have you ever heard of Buckfast?
Yes, the alcohol. Yeah.
Well, it's the
wine
of alcohol and caffeine.
Yeah.
So there's 10 shots of coffee in a bottle of Bucky.
Yeah.
So gets you so hyper.
Yeah. Well,
violent crimes, and they did it in Glasgow. Presented violent crimes. The perpetrator said that they'd drunk specifically Buckfast before committing the crime.
Yeah, it's
probably that combo of alcohol and caffeine. So alcohol disinhibits you, and then the caffeine gives you the energy to go and commit a crime, probably.
Yeah. Oh God, Buckfast. I've committed some Buckfast related crimes, but I can't. Oh, I was such a prick on it. I found myself jumping up and down on a taxi bonnet, swearing at the driver for taking my friend who was covered in her own puke into his taxi, and trying to smash through his window. And then I looked at myself and thought, I'm not going to drink Buckfast again.
The wise decision. No one can drink 10 shots of coffee and a bottle of wine at the same time. And no one needs to do that. Those Benedictine monks, they must have all been buzzing. I'm surprised their monastery wasn't destroyed.
Yeah.
Traffic cones.
Yeah, there can't have been any traffic cones near them. Anyways, listen, let me make the rational sense, the rational case. Does prohibiting drugs or prohibiting certain drugs achieve any end? So does it help? Is it justified? Does it make sense? You know, and quite frankly, the obvious answer is no. It depends what you're trying to achieve. Now, look, if you're trying to fill prison systems with inmates and create recidivists and a lifelong criminal class, then yes, it works. But otherwise, it doesn't. Without any facts at all, we know that like vast sums of money are like to be made through the criminality of selling drugs and transporting them and producing them once they're prohibited. But what you're doing is you're creating incentives within a black market, a market that is unregulated, protected by the law. And as such, the only way that market can then solve disputes, and all those producers and so forth can solve disputes and gain power and gain competitive advantage in that market, is through extreme violence. because they have no recourse to the court system, to the legal system, to any neutral arbitration that is, vaguely peaceful. So, the one stat I came up with is in 7 years, the drug war has caused 165,000 murders in Mexico, 165,000 murders, which is more than the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq at that time combined, considerably more, right? 165,000 people killed on a trafficking route. Mexico's not even a producer, right? And that's, again, I'm backing up a sort of rational case with some facts there. But what I'm trying to say is, does this make sense? Obviously, you don't need to even have heard about Mexico to know that if you criminalize something that people are going to want, and they're going to want it regardless, then you're going to create a black market that's full of violent criminals.
Well, we already exist. I mean, the drug law is so underground. The drug profits are so underground that no one even knows where they're going. So there's a huge gap. We sort of understand that they're produced. A lot of drugs are produced. Cocaine is produced in Colombia, for example. And then there's a sort of a gap, and then it hits the streets. And police are totally it's like a complete mystery of where this gap is. But there's, millions of pounds of profit. It's estimated that it's 1% of the global economy.
Yeah, it must be at least that. I mean, banks such as HSBC keep getting caught out laundering this money because, of course, they have to put it somewhere. But,
there's
if you look at someone like Pablo Escobar, who was they're still finding millions and millions and millions of dollars buried in his estate. They're still to this day.
Really?
Yeah. And a lot of it's unusable. It's rotted and stuff. But they can't do anything with the money. You're taking huge amounts of money out of circulation and having to store them in houses because they have to either launder the money or just keep it. And they build walls, they build houses, they build gardens, that are full of this, cash that are in the hands of, a small cartel of very violent people. Again, there doesn't seem to be any. It doesn't make any sense. It clearly doesn't make any sense. Even if you didn't know all those facts, you know that if you prohibit something that people want, you create a black market. If you create a black market, then there's only one. Then the only people who are going to profit from that market are the kinds of people who are prepared to be criminals, and those kinds of people create violence and death and destruction. And if it's a huge market like the drug market is, then you're giving very violent, dangerous people huge amounts of money. That doesn't make sense. It's not a good way to stop the usage of drugs.
And the government might say that you shouldn't use drugs.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, if this is the point of the war on drugs, to stop people using drugs, it's completely ineffective, clearly. And it was always going to be. Prohibition would always be ineffective because you're not looking at the reason why people use them. And as long as people have money and the capacity to buy and use them, and as long as, by the way, society says that some drugs like alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, and so on, sugar, are acceptable drugs to take. It's like prohibiting some and not the others is gonna.
It's really sort of essentially the government's saying that, it sort of acknowledges that there's huge oceans of unrecoverable money that's just flooding the criminal market and going into all sorts of horrible sort of uses. And their argument against that would be that, well, you shouldn't take drugs and you shouldn't encourage this criminal underworld by buying drugs. But the government explicitly does endorse certain types of drugs. It endorses caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine as acceptable drugs. And poppers are legal. All other drugs are illegal under the, is it the Psychological Substances Act? One second.
You're going to have a look at what?
Just on the so Psychoactive Substances Act 2016 is an act of Parliament that makes all drugs, with the exception of alcohol, nicotine, tobacco, and alkyl nitrates, poppers, illegal.
Yeah. which is
from going back to what your previous slide was. What is the real moral justification that you can? What is the acceptable justification to make alcohol, nicotine, and caffeine and poppers legal when alcohol is one of the most harmful drugs there is?
Yeah, exactly. Again, if you look at the slide, that's it on the far left. Like in terms of damage it does to society.
I mean, that is one of the most ridiculous acts of parliament that that has been constructed. Even this little nugget of information that alcohol, like so a beer contains different types of alcohol. A whiskey contains lots of different types of alcohol. That's what gives it this nice palate. Whereas the Psychoactive Substances Act only legalizes ethanol, but all the other alcohols under the act should be illegal. So really, it's illegal to sell whiskey or beer or any alcohol unless it's pure ethanol.
And of course, we know what happens if you try to make those things illegal, right? Like, that's why Al Capone comes about and so forth like that. They tried it for 10 years. You can't criminalizing. If you don't look in society and if you wanted to eradicate the use of drugs, and personally, I should make this clear, I am actually against the use of all drugs on a personal level. I don't want to see people use them. I recognize we have to live in a society where people don't want to use them. The height of drug and drink taking in Britain was actually during the Victorian era in the mill towns and the factories where people worked there. The gin mills, but people were big opium eaters. They were drunk all the time, and it's why we ended up getting closing times at 11 o'clock, because it was during the First World War. Prior to that, people were going into the factories and getting themselves killed because they're going in drunk. But during the First World War, we had a labour shortage. So before then, it was fine for plebs to go and kill themselves, by getting so battered because they were driven to live in such inhumane conditions that all they could do to escape those conditions was take substances that got them out of their current reality. But then you're like, no, you're only allowed to drink till 11 because we need you plebs to work, and that's why we had all the way up until about 2003, 2004, 11 p.m. closing times. It's because they didn't change the law after the First World War. But it showed you how desperate people were, and it tends to be in the studies showing again that people take drugs to escape the reality they live in, right? That's what they do. So if you want to stop people taking drugs, then address the problems that people have with this current reality. Address the reasons why they want to get out of there and escape for it. Or don't do it at all. Don't draw a line for some nor the others. Also, again, we never address why people take drugs, and we never look at it as a social issue like we do, at least marginally, with sugar and alcohol and caffeine. Because with sugar and alcohol, with regulated, legalized substances, we look at regulatory responses. We say there's certain ages that you can drink at, there's certain places that you can take these substances, there's taxes put upon them to cover the cost of the harms that they create. And we look at, instead of criminalizing people who drink alcohol, we look at social, cultural, educational, health programs in response. And of course, that's the way to treat the use of any mind-altering substance, right? You can't prohibit them, you legalize them, and then utilize the money that's made, instead of it going into vast criminal violent empires that cause death and misery, right? You use that money instead to pay for the mitigation for the cost of looking after the social harms that are created by the use of these drugs. The social harms, by the way, would be severely less than alcohol. We already know how to deal with the most extreme drug available, so it's not going to be a problem looking after these other ones, right? It's not going to be a problem taxing cannabis and then providing educational lessons saying don't eat too many Cheetos when you're getting high, it's not a particularly hard thing to do. Also, the costs to society of these unregulated industries of prohibiting substances are huge. We're talking the costs of policing and imprisoning which in many countries require huge armed mobilizations that are greater than is necessary for war. In fact, they utilize in many countries, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, like the Philippines, Afghanistan, they utilize armies, right? Either to protect the drug producers or to attack them. And they are living in a state of war. Like Mexico's in a state of war. Many parts of America, like Baltimore, has a murder rate that's higher than the entirety of the United Kingdom, right? And that's largely due to the money gone into the drug trade. So the cost of policing, imprisoning people who both use and deal or traffic, in trying to stop the flow of the substances is so extraordinarily expensive to society that stopping doing that would be a great benefit, even if you just decriminalized it. I believe in legalization, regulation, put age limits on it. I shouldn't have been able to start smoking weed when I was 14. I shouldn't have been able to do that, but it was easier to get hold of than alcohol. Like that shouldn't be a reality, right? That's what happens when you have a black market.
I'm gonna nip off and get a beer, man. Hold on.
Yeah.
Need to top up my drug.
Yeah.
So what would you be recommending, Barlow, in your What We Should Do? What's the name of it? What We Should Do?
The way we change things.
The way
it should be. So I've been doing another meeting earlier today. So the way it should be is we should legalize all drugs. We should regulate them.
You've essentially got 4 ways of doing it, don't you? In terms of drug policy, anyway. So you can have a prohibition, which is what we've got, or you can have a decriminalization system, or we can have a regulatory system, which is what we used to have for alcohol, or we can have a free market system, which is what we do have for alcohol, essentially. So
and free markets are absolutely devastating, aren't they? An unregulated market. Like, just imagine a market town with an unregulated market where anyone could sell anything. You'd get fucking body parts and and shysters selling you crap all the time. One of the other things, by the way, about having a prohibited market is it makes the drug stronger because you've got to transport a lot in a little. And so you're trying to make the drugs as strong as possible so that you can get as much to the consumer as possible. Because, you can only transport so much. Having said that, a fascinating fact is that out of all the policing efforts that the US undertakes, they actually manage to negatively impact less than 1% of drugs coming into or transported around the country. They literally stop less than 1% of all drugs getting about. So prohibition is the most incredibly ineffective system for stopping drugs.
Just to go in on that point, you're talking about huge profits, especially for drugs like cocaine. Very cheap to manufacture, but very expensive to buy.
Yeah.
So in order to actually bankrupt these criminal organizations, you would need to be seizing a vast amount of their profits. A vast amount of their stock. Just because the profits are so huge, you need to be seizing at least 50% of their stock. And if you're only seizing 1%, you're not getting anywhere close to bankrupting these criminal organizations.
The markup's so huge, you'd have to probably take around about 80%. The markup is so huge because it costs less than $1 a gram in Colombia, and that's on the street. So it's it's probably maybe 10 cents a gram.
Is that right?
And so and then imagine it's £50 a gram in London, or more, right? But let's say it's 50. Think about the amount of markup there is on that. How much money is being made. Utterly impossible to stop. So we need to live in a world. The way it should be is this. We should live in a world where drugs are legalized, regulated, and I would like to see them highly regulated. I'd like to see that the age for being allowed to do mind-altering substances would be 21 or even 25. Your brain is still very plastic. It's got there's quite a lot of neuroplasticity, i.e. you're changing a lot up until the age of 25. And I think affecting that with mind-altering drugs is extremely negative, and I would like to see it regulated at least to the age of 21, but ideally 25.
You could
I'm very anti the use of drugs.
If you open the door, children, or well, under 21-year-olds, as you said, are going to be able to access them. It's like there's a drink limit of 21 in America, frequently.
18-year-olds. Well, you put a limit so they can get within 2 or 3 years of it, right? Like I started drinking at 14, 15 because the drinking age is 18 in England, like that's the age that you can legitimately get away with like looking like an 18-year-old, which is weird, isn't it? At the age of 15 usually, right? So
I don't think
say 25.
You have a system where you can join the army, say at 18, and vote at 18, and drive a car at 17, and yet there's going to be some parts of society where you're prohibited to do it until you're 21. I just don't think people would buy that.
What, by that you're not allowed to do substances under the age of 21?
Do you not think that people would? Well, the argument would be, well, I can vote. I'm an adult. I have consent, legal consent, and capacity. Why would I not be able to?
Well, personally, I would raise the age that people are allowed to join the army, because currently it's 16. I would raise that to 21. Like, I think there's a lot of things that are not like, there are a lot of things that shouldn't be, I think driving is, I think we should be looking at wiping that out. And that's a different thing. But like, we shouldn't be living in a society where people need to have personal vehicles and have personal licenses, and also be driving 10 tons of metal that can like murder people, because like I think it's the number 1 or number 2 cause of death in the UK still is like people killing people in cars. So like that needs to be severely regulated, and I'm not and it's usually young drivers. It's usually 17-year-olds or 18-year-olds. So there are cases for making an age limit on that. I would like, the way it should be is this: we legalize it, we regulate it, we put an age limit of 21 on all drugs, we put huge amounts of the money that's made, we tax it, and we regulate it so that it is government-owned stores or publicly owned cooperatives that are managed by stakeholders and members of the community, rather than private corporations. We don't want corporations running drug companies for profit, and they pay a high level of tax, and that money goes back into community programs of a whole range. Like they pay their general taxes, but maybe they also pay a specific tax that covers drug use education, because again, there's just a lot of misinformation about like the use of drugs and what you can and can't do. Like that's what I think. That's the way it should be. So we legalize it, we tax it, we take the money from it that goes into society. The tax spend is then used to provide benefits to society that pulls all of us up. The money that is created from that is a benefit of society. Plus, there's an extra fund created specifically to deal with education around the usage of drugs. There's regulation on the age limit so that people are getting into it at a less young age, because currently people get into it a lot more. We just take all this money out of the hands of violent criminals, and we also save ourselves loads of money in imprisoning people, which costs about £40,000 per year per person, and all the costs on policing. So we save society huge amounts of money. We make society loads of money. We create a better, more equal society, and we give people freedom of choice within limits. It's a no-brainer. It's the way it should be. Like, there's not really, I can't think of any counter-argument to that. Your one counter-argument is like, don't make the age limit 25. Whereas I would like to do that. I'd like to see that, but I think 21 with drug education,
So you're not looking towards, you're basically looking towards a regulated market, like what we used to have with alcohol in the 70s, for example. where you can only buy it in specific shops, and it's regulated, so you can't advertise. Do you need to have a prescription?
No, it's not a medical. It's got to be legalized for recreational use, and then you have the same regulations in place that you have had for alcohol, which is that it can only be used in certain places, that have licenses to do so. I have a bar license. You have to pass it. You do 2 days of studying, to pass, you do 2 days of tests and you do a load of studying beforehand to get a license to be allowed to serve alcohol. It's not just something that you're allowed to do. It's like, even though lots of people work behind bars, very few people are licensees, so so you have to get a license to serve it, to distribute it.
You have a place where people could would you have a cocaine bar?
I mean, I don't see why not. Like at the moment, for instance, in England, you have A1 to A4 licenses, and if I'm correct, A1 allows you to sell certain foods and snacks in your newsagents. A2 allows you to sell nicotine and things like that. A3 allows you to sell hot food, and A4 allows you to sell alcohol, right? And it goes up in levels, basically. I think that's roughly it. So you create an A5 maybe, and that includes other formerly prohibited drugs, other mind-altering drugs other than alcohol, and you have certain licensed premises that have those things. But as you say, unmarked packaging, no advertising. Advertising is completely illegal around it.
You have campaigns to try and raise awareness to the harms.
What's that? Sorry.
You have harm awareness campaigns.
Yeah, educational campaigns on harm awareness, but also how to use drugs safely, what the effects will be, and so on.
You can definitely see the benefits of even running education campaigns now, even though there's a prohibition, and also sort of drug testing, just so people can check the purity of the drugs. It seems to be there's no sort of it's not stopping people from taking drugs. People are taking drugs. That's why it's still in the news. We're trying to reduce that harm as much as possible, if that is the government's intention, which was the initial intention for the Misuse of Drugs Act. Then it needs to be thinking of education campaigns. I mean, to give the most sort of infamous case, Leah Bates tragically died in 1995, didn't she?
Yeah, from drinking too much water. Yeah, Leah Bates.
Yeah, she drank too much water. Her friend said that water is what you do if you take. She took 2 ecstasy pills. In 1995, the dose was much higher, so that's probably about a 300 milligram dose of MDMA. She probably would have felt maybe a bit too intoxicated, but unfortunately her friends convinced her to drink something like 10 pints of water, which creates a hyponatremia, and it can poison you. Tragically, that's what happened to her. But that's nothing to do with the drug itself. She didn't. I mean, it was largely reported that the drug MDMA was dangerous following the Leah Bates case, but that's not factually correct. Really, what they should have been reporting was that water was dangerous.
Well, also that our education system is dangerous. Like, if you don't educate people on how to do things safely, then people are going to die. And it's like a lot of things that we don't do. Like, we literally don't teach people. It's not a course at school. You don't do GCSEs in first aid or how to ensure that your water's drinkable. Like, our education system fails us in loads of areas that means that we're safe, but should be safe. But yeah, again, what you can do is you can regulate drug producers as well, can't you? And that means they're spot checked. They have to produce things to a particular standard with a particular mix that doesn't endanger people. Loads of ecstasy in my time, even weed, used to be laced with heroin. It used to be laced with other things as well. So these are the things that we want to avoid, is damage to great swathes of people, because at least 2 million Britons take recreational drugs every weekend. Right? That's currently,
regardless of the criminal sanctions. I mean, there's an incredible statistic that so many people do break the law on a regular basis.
Yeah, and of course, everyone in this country breaks the law because there's so many stupid laws, like all the time. As I pulled up here, David Cameron said he got off in his head on cannabis in Eton, so he broke the law, right? And that's him.
An incredible headline. When was that? 2019.
Yeah, 2000.
So admitted to breaking a law, and not a trivial law. So cannabis is currently a Class B restricted substance. Carries
not even Class C. Yeah.
Sorry?
It's not even Class C. It used to be Class C. It's a Class B, isn't it?
Yeah, it was downgraded to Class C in 2009, but it's been recently upgraded. Or was it upgraded to Class B in 2009? I forget. But yeah, it's Class B, and that carries a criminal sanction of 5 years imprisonment. So potentially, like, you could have a situation where David Cameron, from admitting of that headline, should have to go to jail if you were going by the letter of the law. I mean, realistically, no one's going to get that level of sanction. But it is on the statute books. The Misuse of Drugs Act is very clear. The maximum sentence for possession, of cannabis is five years jail committal.
Yeah, and by the way, there's people who argue, conservatives, lots of conservatives who argue that people who have criminal records shouldn't be allowed to vote. Well, we've got loads of criminals who are members of parliament and prime ministers, because I'm pretty certain, I'd have to look this up, but I'm pretty sure Boris Johnson admitted something similar. I've got like a headline here, prime minister was at a cocaine party. Like, George Osborne, I think, has been implicated in taking cocaine, most of the front bench. And of course, you'd expect that. Oops. But
it's a staggering kind of sort of indictment on our political class that they have admitted to doing serious crimes. And it seems to be so blasé. And it sort of just means, it's sort of an indication how seriously or not seriously they take laws. If they're willing to admit to such a serious crime, then
you shouldn't be allowed to enforce a law that you're unwilling to follow. I mean, we should all be allowed to make mistakes and commit crimes and still go on to have a productive life and take any position in society, because I don't believe that if you just because you've committed a crime, you can't.
For example, in this, I remember reading this story, and David Cameron was at Eton. He was told to do lines on the blackboard, but under the Misuse of Drugs Act, lines on a blackboard isn't one of the criminal sanctions.
Yeah. See, in June, Michael Gove admitted taking cocaine on several occasions. So that's Michael Gove. Boris Johnson deflected questions over drug use. Jeremy Hunt said he might. Rory Stewart smoked opium. Andrea Lebson smoked cannabis. Jeremy Hunt has had I think maybe opium. It looks like, according to this report. Like, I mean, it doesn't. It seems when so predominantly so many of your significant. What's that?
What was that, crab?
Yeah, it's a weird crab, isn't it?
And that's nothing to do with the story of drugs.
No, it's just something that you can use in pictures today.
People are crabbing. When you get a sort of a ridiculous situation, so imagine like someone is just smoking a cannabis cigarette or splifter.
Yeah.
Parlance in their house.
Yeah.
Maybe just watching some TV, and a police officer doing the line of duty could break into that person's house and arrest them.
Yeah.
And then if that person happens to be maybe growing a cannabis plant, that's production of a Class B drug. That's got a criminal sanction of 14 years. You could really ruin someone's life for something that's so innocuous. To give you a comparison, grievous bodily harm with racial intent carries a maximum sentence of 7 years. So you're looking at twice the criminal sanction for growing a cannabis plant as you are for grievous bodily harm with racial intent. Now, in what society are those two crimes commensurate?
Well, here's the thing. So, Nixon official who has a recording with Nixon, who started the war on drugs in the 70s, said the real reason for the war, the drug war, was to criminalize black people and hippies. And he has recordings of this. This was their domestic policy. He said, so this is from a reporter, and he was talking to a guy called Ehrlichman, who was his domestic advisor, and he was asking Ernest wonky questions, which Ehrlichman impatiently waved away. You want to know what that was really all about? He asked, with the bluntness of a man who, after a public disgrace and a stretch in federal prison, had little left to protect. The Nixon campaign in 1968, and the Nixon White House after that, had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Mm.
Nixon started this because it's not supposed to stop the use of drugs, and everyone who's in government knows it's one rule for one rule for the other. These laws are going to be selectively used. They give them these high sentences, and they only use those high sentences against left-wingers and ethnic minorities, right? Like, that's the thing. Again, in Britain, it's the same as the US. Disproportionately, black people get arrested for the same crimes, even though white people use illegal drugs more than black people, right? Disproportionately.
What you were saying earlier about Manchester, they were just saying that we're going to voluntarily not prosecute for people who are smoking weed. Well, who's making that decision? That shouldn't be in the hands of the police. The police aren't legislators.
No, well, they said they said they'll have to follow the law. The police didn't make that decision. They said, I was saying that, look, people in the force say they support it, especially people who've come out after the force said, look, we support the legalization. But in the statement, when the councillor said, look, I'd like us to decriminalize it, or at least not bother, I want the police to not make the effort of arresting people. The police came out and said, our duty is to enforce the law, and that's what we'll do.
So I misinterpreted that. But at the same time, there is you could acknowledge maybe perhaps that there is a sort of a police discretion, maybe, in terms of drug law. So
yes, it is selectively. So they talk about both selective application of police forces. So the police over-police black and ethnic minority and left-wing communities,
right.
and
so if two people are smoking a spliff, the police can decide who to arrest. Essentially, you've got this sort of situation where both are criminals, but the police have the option to decide whether to racially profile one and not the other.
Yeah, but more importantly, they will be applied to black and poor neighborhoods. So the police will be used to police. Like, David Cameron admits to smoking weed in Eton. Well, there wasn't any police in Eton, but guess what? There's police in Moss Side School, which is a black working class school. There's lots of if there was police in my school, if there was police in my school where I grew up, everyone and the law was enforced correctly, everyone that you've met now you would have never met, because all of my mates from Leicester, including myself, would be in prison, right? But they don't do a white countryside school. That's not where the police. So it's where police resources are put. But then also, what's being proven is also that judges or magistrates, usually judges when it's a criminal case, tend to hand out harder sentences for ethnic minorities and or working class people and or people who politically seem left wing. Right. And so, like, this was the point. So, look, Nixon set it up for this reason. And that's why the Tory front bench, you can rise to the highest office in the land, take drugs, tell people about it, break the law, tell people about it, continue to enforce the law without changing anything. and get away with it with no comment, with you not having even seen the story, right? You've not even seen the story because it doesn't matter. Of course, everyone takes drugs. We're all fine. It's such a liberal society. Well, it's not a liberal, we can get away with doing drugs, because a lot of us who do drugs would see it as basically not illegal, right? Like, because, you know, you basically don't, you know, no one you know has ever been arrested. Right?
It's like what I said about the sort of parallel to growing a cannabis plant. Production of a Class B drug, 14 years, grievous bodily harm of racial intent, 7. No one would really, honestly, conceivably compare those two in terms of like crime.
No.
You know, people would grow a cannabis plant potentially in their house, but they wouldn't think, oh well, I'm going to go and, you know, attack someone on the street. They know the difference between moral crimes, really.
Yeah.
Just crimes that are purely statutory.
Yeah, though it is left to a judge's discretion. And again, if the judge has a particular bent against certain people, you know, they can enforce it at levels that it should be, which is why the way it should be is that all drugs are legalized, all drugs are regulated. And then the only crimes you're committing is misproduction of drugs, using drugs in the wrong circumstances, like, for instance, when driving, or yes, you know, selling drugs to the wrong age group, you know, or in a way that is not licensed, you know. And
like drugs are, I mean, having that potential on the statute books, drugs are just so harmful. I mean, I was just thinking, because there's mushroom season now, and the UK has a native psilocybin mushroom, Liberty Cap, which grows everywhere.
Yeah.
For a walk now, if you go into like grassy pasture land, you're probably going to find one. No, that's a Class A restricted substance under the Misuse of Drug Act, psilocybin. And basically, you've got a situation where those mushrooms are incredibly dangerous in terms of criminal sanctions. So just say you're collecting mushrooms, you're an avid mushroom collector, and you accidentally pop a Liberty Cap into your basket, and then a policeman catches you. You have possession of a Class A drug, and that carries a criminal sanction of 7 years imprisonment. Realistically, you're not going to get that, but potentially you have, you know, it's an incredibly dangerous thing. Or even you could have an even more absurd example of a Liberty Cap mushroom growing in your back garden.
Yeah.
And if the policeman was inclined, they could say, well, you're producing a Class A drug, which carries a life sentence. You know, these criminal sanctions, like what happened to Oscar Wilde, they're not trivial. They're extremely severe.
Yeah. If they're applied. And the thing is, we shouldn't give the government, the police, the courts any leeway to be able to apply them, because those are ludicrous punishments. Ludicrous.
But you're often you're stuck in a bit of a bind, because you would say perhaps that it's very important for people to be on the right side of the law, because going to jail is one of the most never mind drugs, going to jail can be one of the most harmful things any person could go through. It gets you in communication with
yeah, so just Portugal,
as I said before, it just ruins any career prospects. So you've got a situation where you would probably advise someone, don't do drugs, not necessarily because they're harmful, as you saw with the David Nutt graphic, but because the criminal sanctions are so high. But then at what point would you sort of flip that? Because, I mean, I mentioned about the criminal sanctions on, you know, being gay before 1960s. And would you then at that time say, well, no, you shouldn't be gay because the criminal sanctions are so high? You know, it would seem immoral to say that to someone. And at the same time, now with drug law, it would seem strange to say, you know, you shouldn't smoke a spliff or whatever your drug preference is because the criminal sanctions are so high, if they think it's not an immoral act.
Yes, well, that's the thing. Like, you know, that's the question: is taking something that alters your state of mind an immoral act? Now, clearly, the majority of people don't think that, because the majority of people think drinking alcohol is fine. I don't think it's an immoral act. I don't think it's a sensible act. I don't think it's desirable that people feel like they need to get out of their heads. But there's nothing immoral about it.
Yeah,
is there?
I agree.
There's nothing.
There is something illegal about it, and should that stop you from doing it?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, no. So yeah, I think at this point we should. You've got a chess match to get to.
Mm-hmm.
We should wrap it up. But like, there is no case for, as far as I can tell, for the prohibition of any substances. There's a great case for the legalization and regulation. So I guess that's the only, on the last point then, would you be opposed to legalization and regulation? Or do you think it should be just decriminalized, or or maybe we should legalize it and let companies produce it? Or do you think, as I would say, it'd be legalized, regulated, and publicly produced rather than privately?
Well, it's difficult to know, isn't it? What one to go down? I think the prohibitionist approach, you're right. You've convinced me. It's not really. It doesn't really work. Especially having if we have these huge criminal sanctions already on the statute books, you can't really increase life imprisonment. For example, production of a Class A drug, you can't increase that. That's the max you can get, and it's not working.
Yeah.
So it needs to be revised. You can't have these huge criminal sanctions on the statute book, especially if a majority of the population disagree with them. I mean, there's never been a referendum, for example, on drug use. So if you think about how damaging it is to prosecute people who are taking drugs, it's very expensive to prosecute them, to pay for judicial services, to pay for prisons, and that all comes out of taxpayers' money. But I've never been asked as a taxpayer whether or not I agree with the prohibition.
Yeah.
So I think it's something that maybe we would need to have a referendum on and see if people would oppose it, because it's so expensive, and everyone's paying into the communal pocket, so they should probably have some sort of say, at least, on whether or not this is a good.
Yeah, that's a really good way of framing it. In fact, that's a perfect way to end it, which is what we should be campaigning for, is a referendum at least on the prohibition of substances, because as we pay for the policing and punishment of people who use drugs and sell them and traffic them, then seeing as it's a cost that we bear, we should have to give our consent to that, and at least examine the issue, because my feeling is the appetite in society for change and the ending of this prohibition is actually quite high, at least for cannabis. But I would like to see it for all drugs, if not in the near term, then at least in the long term.
Well, click back to that graphic with David Nutt. Where's cannabis in that?
Let's see.
So cannabis, there's still harm. It's staggering how harmful alcohol is. Alcohol is more harmful than heroin and crack cocaine. And ecstasy is extremely low, isn't it? And LSD.
Yeah.
And mushrooms. Mushrooms are Class A drugs. So he's saying that the least harmful drug is a Class A prohibited substance under the misuse of drugs.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a kind of ludicrous. I mean, it kind of goes that, the misuse of drugs was initially created to sort of just reflect harm. That's why we have classification of drugs. A being harmful, C being but no drug has ever been declassified apart from cannabis briefly.
Yeah.
The legislation doesn't reflect the facts. I mean, David Nutt, as far as I remember, was the drug advisor for the government at one stage, wasn't he?
Yes, and he was sacked for producing the report that he was commissioned to do, and this is that report.
Right. So they just basically sacked him rather than taking scientific advice?
Yeah, they sacked him for having the temerity for presenting evidence. He'd clearly been hired to do the opposite job, to say like drugs are bad and we should wage this war on drugs. And he's like, well, I looked at, I'm a scientist and I looked at the facts, and there is no factual case for.
Can you think of any other example of any other criminal law, where you would get a scientific advisory panel that would say that the harms would outweigh, like any other law, they would come back and say, no, that it's justified because the harm of this crime is so high that we need to on the statute books, like drink driving.
Driving is a classic example. A lot of regulations came in around driving because of the evidence. Whether it's texting on your phone, speed limits, bringing in speed bumps, traffic cameras. So there's lots of regulation around driving, right? And all of that comes in because of evidence presented. The specific speed limits, specific ways of managing and regulating the way that driving occurs is beneficial for society, and leaving it unregulated in particular ways is damaging, right? Like, so they presented that evidence and were like, okay, well, we'll change the speed limit. We'll introduce speed bumps. We'll introduce speed cameras. We'll, include extra things in the test that you have to take to get a driving license, which has become a lot more complicated than, say, when my parents took it, right? None of that around drugs. They were like,
to reduce the drink driving limit for alcohol, even though it is quite dangerous, but it's because it's so opposed, because people love alcohol.
Yeah.
Like, it should be flipped. Alcohol is a legal substance. It's the most damaging. And these ones, I'm just having a look. Mushrooms, class A. Buprenorphine, I don't know. LSD, class A. Ecstasy, class A. Anabolic steroids, not sure. Cat is methadone. Not sure about methadone. But anyway, basically, you've got...
Cat is that drug that comes from Somalia, or Somalians take? It's that
right, one that Cathinone is methadone, so cat is that leaf that you chew, isn't it? Yeah. That's recently been criminalized, I think.
Fucking hell.
But anyway, you got an example where the most dangerous drug seems to be the least harmful.
Yeah.
And the most dangerous drug is legal. Yeah.
Well, the next topic is going to be a little bit more rowdy, I have a feeling. So you'll probably disagree with my proposition there. So the way we'll go through it next time is I'll present what it should be, the arguments for it, and then I'll let you rip into it properly. Okay, lovely, jubbly. And I'll send you over précis beforehand as well. Like, I'll send you over like what my rough argument's going to be, so you can have a think of why I'm a knob and why I'm wrong. Yeah. Okay, that's us for today. So I've enjoyed seeing you, man. Good luck with the chess. It's lovely to see you with a beer in hand and just your beautiful face. We'll catch you on the next one, same time-ish next week.
Okay, man. What is it? I'm asking you, what's the topic next week?
The topic next week is, oh crikey, let me see if I can pull it up. The topic next week is doing Prohibition. Next week is anti-fascism. Is violence acceptable against fascists? Which I will be saying, yes, the way it should be is violence should be totally acceptable against fascists.
Wow.
So that will cause some more problems. All right, man.
All right.
I'll catch you soon. We'll end the podcast now. I'll see you later. Bye.
See you later, man.